Screamer the Swift. It's not just another brick in the wall. Text by John Miles and artwork by Barry Robson. The population of swifts in Britain has fallen by 50% due to the lack of nesting holes in buildings. Screamer the Swift, sponsored by Ibstock Bricks Limited. The sky was full of heat and the swifts were having fun flying high above the city of Bath. They were catching mouthfuls of insects over Victoria Park. Down came both Mum and Dad to a small crack in the impressive Royal Crescent, an historic street of houses in the shape of an arc built in the Georgian period. They came at such a speed you would have thought they would crash into the wall, but they just vanished into the crack as if it was as big as the entrance to the Channel Tunnel. Inside was little Screamer, all alone, waiting for fast food to be brought in to feed his ever-increasing appetite. Flies, daddy-long-legs, spiders and aphids were swallowed whole in a ball of protein to help him grow his feathers. One day he too would be able to clamber out of the crack and enjoy the sky like his mum and dad. No sooner had the food been delivered than he was back on his own in the dark, as mum and dad needed to find more food for their growing son. Generations of swift had moved from nesting in old holes in trees to nesting in buildings. Trees were cut down by early man to make fields for growing food. Many of the older trees, which once covered Britain, were worshipped by early man. Once the trees had gone, there must have been a period when swift numbers suffered due to the lack of nest holes. But once the Romans came to Britain to build large stone villas, and other buildings like the Bath House, which gave Bath its name, the swifts would have had new nest sites. Their impressive building techniques would last a long time, allowing swifts to nest in the stonework. This is just as well, since the many Saxon and Viking wooden houses built later were not suitable at all. So it was not until the Normans came in the 11th century, 1,000 years ago, and built many castles and churches, that swifts yet again had good walls to nest in. Screamer was glad of his nest site in amazing Royal Crescent. It had a great view down to the Avon Valley, where soon he would be flying with the rest of the swifts. This day came, and all he had to do was squeeze out of the nest hole and flap his wings, and he was off into the sky. What a feeling! There was lots of daylight after his dark hole. He could feel the wind in his face at last. His swept-back wings resembled the Royal Crescent he was born in. Over Victoria Park, around the Abbey and the Roman bathhouse, and along the River Avon he flew. This is much better than that dark hole, he thought. What Screamer did not know was that from leaving the nest hole to becoming a breeding bird, he would not actually touch a hard surface of the earth again. He was so well adapted to spending the majority of his life in the sky, his legs had shrunk to a very small size. With his very long wings, Screamer would have problems taking off from the ground. His tiny legs and feet would have to push him up while his wings would flap hopelessly against the ground trying to get a lift. His legs are so short, his Greek name means without feet. This is why swifts prefer high nest sites to keep them from hitting the ground. Another new experience would be sleeping on the wing, high up in the air. It was not long before the urge to migrate took hold of the swifts around Bath. Having arrived in Britain in May, adult swifts can leave as early as the end of July to start their long migrations south into Africa. Screamer was about to embark on a long journey of discovery. One of the oldest swifts ever recorded was 21 years old. In its lifetime, it could have travelled 3 million miles, nearly 5 million kilometres, migrating and feeding. The first time Screamer saw the sea was over the Jurassic coast at Lyme Regis in Dorset. Here fossils of past life on Earth lay buried for millions of years. Even remains of some of Screamer's long-lost relatives dating back 50 million years have been found, but these were in Germany, not here. The swifts flew over the sea to France and south of the mountains of the Pyrenees, where other types of swifts, the much bigger alpine swift, were joining up with Screamer. Over Spain they flew until they came to a huge rock with funny Barbary apes, which sat on the walls trying to steal cameras from the many tourists. This was Gibraltar, and the last bit of Europe before crossing the Straits of Gibraltar into Africa. Screamer flew round the rock with large numbers of black kites, honey buzzards and white storks, rising on bubbles of warm air, the thermals, to get more height so they could save energy by gliding the 14 miles to Africa. Luckily, Screamer did not need to save energy as he was feeding as he went along. "They are all too slow to catch me," he thought gleefully. In no time at all, Screamer was in Morocco enjoying the heat. Soon, though, the heat would become intense as he crossed the Sahara Desert, which covers 10% of Africa. The answer was to gain height like the birds of prey and use the high-up jet stream winds, which would speed up his journey into more friendly skies. The last thing Screamer would want to meet was a sandstorm blocking his view and filling his mouth with sand as he tried to feed. With the rest of the swifts, he managed to make it across the sands and into the west of Africa, stopping over for a few weeks around the Gambia's lovely river. Here too were many other birds. Some of them, like the young osprey, had spent summer down here as they waited for their turn to head to Britain when they were older. Many of the houses were made of wood, like the Saxon ones years ago in Britain, and certainly would not be of any use for nesting swifts. People here were carrying many objects on their heads, and their colourful garments were certainly different to those worn by people in Britain. Deeper into Africa they went, and soon the swifts were over the Congo Basin. Now Screamer was seeing some amazing tropical forests, and soon he was out onto the plains of Zambia. He could not believe his eyes. There was a strange beast with a horn sticking out of its nose, and another with 2 tusks growing out of its mouth. They looked like they had been on the planet for millions of years. And what about that guy with the long neck? These were, of course, a rhinoceros, an elephant, and a giraffe. Screamer was certainly having his eyes open to some amazing sights and sounds. It was now winter in Britain, but Screamer, having flown 7,000 miles, just over 11,000 kilometres, was enjoying summer down here in the southern hemisphere. Screamer even flew to Mozambique, where he saw the Indian Ocean. His wings never got tired, but his legs were tucked away, waiting for the time he would finally use them again. As the daylight started to shorten, this was the signal for the adult swifts to start heading north again. This time the swifts used the west coast of Africa to avoid the heat of the Sahara, crossing back into Europe over the rock and through Spain to France and across the English Channel. The time came when Screamer was screaming around the buildings of Bath again, looking for a hole in a building where he could encourage a mate to join him in creating a family of his own. He flew up to the Royal Crescent only to find the hole where he was born had been blocked up with cement. There were no holes on the whole of this massive building for him to nest in. "Where am I to find one?" he asked himself anxiously. Many older swifts had found their nest holes in other parts of town, but the holes were getting to be in short supply. Maintenance work on old buildings meant that the holes where the swifts wanted to nest were filled in. New buildings had no holes at all. Where was Screamer to find a nest site? Help was at hand down by Kensington Meadows, a local nature reserve by the River Avon. Special brick nest boxes designed for swifts had been put up for the returning birds to use. Screamer flew into one of the entrances and looked inside. Nesting material was needed to make this a neat home. Off he went to catch flying feathers in the wind to bring back for his box. His partner did the same, and soon they were snug as could be and ready to start a new generation of Screamers. One of the most famous artificial swift nest sites still exists today. It's in the Oxford University Museum of Natural History, where swifts were studied in the 1950s by David Lack. And you've been listening to Screamer the Swift. It's not just another brick in the wall. Text by John Miles and artwork by Barry Robson.